This is going to be very brief in comparison to what Peter extensively covered. This is a great job, Peter. Thank you so much, because I remember witnessing some parts of your process, right? When you were a postdoc at Crown, and you were talking about this and finishing your first book and making these decisions on what to keep, because in reality, we end up like the table that Peter showed a while ago is basically a table that, as he mentioned, it's a small reflection of thousands of pages of work, meticulous connecting the dots between different events, sequences, groups, actors, in order to show that final neat result. So the neatness that Peter demonstrated is not one that you can find in the archives. You end up like, there's just an example from one of the first personal photographs that I had from Maryland. And that was one batch on one day. And that consisted of, if I'm not mistaken, about 24 boxes. As you can see, there's my name there. But that was like 24 boxes. And out of these 24 boxes, I actually used maybe 1 or 2 pages for what I'm doing right now. And that's 24 boxes of documents. So the neat part that Peter demonstrated right now should not come as a result of one book, one article, but it's really thousands of pages. So I'll just give you a quick example before we go to the Q&A. So this is an example from my book manuscript and my research on US intelligence and foreign policy in the Middle East, specifically during moments that are revolutionary. So in reality, who are my actors, right? State Department officials, CIA, National Security Council, presidential papers, interview transcripts, memoirs, and archival sources and secondary documents in the MENA. So this seems like a full plate, and it is a full plate. But in reality, can I ever do justice by looking at all these units and all their papers? Bearing in mind what Peter mentioned earlier on, that in some cases, the documents might be next to your home, exactly next to your home. So I remember when I was living in Boston, Harvard basically had tons of documents on reports and papers that were written during the Kennedy administration, the Eisenhower administration, that were stored at Lamont Library on microfilm, just to give you an example. So that saved me the trip from going up to DC. But in reality, that also brought another layer of guilt, which is I know they're there. I know these 18 microfilms are there. And right now I can't really avoid that. I don't have access to them because it's one bus ride away or walking distance from where I was living when I was working and residing in Boston and Cambridge. Just to give you an example, like this is a very neat way of saying, how can I really understand and study US intelligence and foreign policy during times of revolution? And these are some of the most important actors. To give you an example from a book that came out that I edited in September 2020, my original thinking, just to give you what Peter was mentioning regarding embracing archival documents, not running away from them. And this is exactly my train of thought when I was doing this book with authors and scholars that have been working, that are historians, political scientists, and sociologists, right? So the original thinking behind this project was that revolutionary processes were only important and transformative for states in the MENA. So we began from that based on existing literature. We read the existing literature, and it seemed that the moment in 1958, which is a very important moment in the history of the modern Middle East, was really important for states in the region, right? If you haven't done any archival research, you haven't pushed really the limits of what's available in secondary accounts, you won't get to the conclusion that we're able to come and refine our existing thoughts. And this is what I do in my own chapter in the actual book, which is in reality, this is going to seem like a very easy process, but the deep archival research led me to refine my existing original mindset, which is that revolutionary processes were equally transformative for foreign powers, including the US and others. This very small qualifier, what makes it revolutionary for the US and for Britain and for France at that point in time, was not easily found in secondary accounts. So the more I was digging into Eisenhower's records, into State Department files, into CIA files, it gave me another story of the recalibration of US current strategy, the shift in coming to terms with what is really a nuanced version of the Anglo-American special relationship. It's not one that was really divided only based on Cold War dynamics. It wasn't East versus West or America versus Soviet Union. There's a lot of gray area and a lot of nuance in the middle that pointed to American dissatisfaction with British policies and French policies, whether it's France and Algeria, whether it's Britain in Egypt and Suez, whether it's America and Jordan. But these dynamics were nowhere to be found if one had not done the actual empirical, the actual archival research. And that also pushed me to really refocus and recenter the attention on Suez. what sways meant in terms of a crisis, in terms of a war for that moment in 58. So the refined conclusion coming out of that book was that when we think about revolutions, we have to move beyond the binary of success or failure, and also move away from the binary that this was only important for Abdel Nasser or for Jordan or for Syria, or what happened with the coups in 1956 or the coups in Jordan in 1957, or the revolutionary moment in Lebanon in 1958. That in reality, this was a moment where France and Britain had to come to terms with their decline in power, and America had to come to terms with the idea that even as the dominant Western patron in the Middle East, this new led order was not easy to sustain. So this is something that when we think about IR, right, we just adopt a perspective of great powers versus small powers. But in reality, once we dig deeper into the archives, I was able to retrace the role of local actors and their influence on decision-making processes and circles. And I got into these archives that Peter was mentioning, where a telephone conversation occurring on a Sunday afternoon between the Lebanon's foreign minister at that point in time, Sharm Malik, and President Eisenhower, right? On a Sunday afternoon, that conversation happening between the Lebanese diplomat and an American president is not something you're going to find in the secondary account. But I was able to find the transcript, what they discussed, and it had some fun aspects that Peter was mentioning, that President Eisenhower was asleep between this hour and that hour. He's going to have his tea at this hour, and then he had this conversation. You can go into those details, but the most important part of it was that the foreign minister of Lebanon at that point in time had a somewhat direct line to the President of the United States of America. And that's something that I was able to basically come up with once I was doing the archival research. And another example from an article that I published, and it got awarded the best article in Intelligence and National Security in 2017, 2018, also began with the idea on intelligence, right? It began with the idea that if I'm thinking about the American intelligence failure, everyone's talking about the intelligence failure in Iraq in 2003. And I said, well, obviously there should be a longer history for this. So when I started doing secondary reading, it all focused on the idea of analysis. And there are so many great names out there that I can mention right now, we can talk more about, that focus on issues of analysis, whether it's political psychologists. Here we can talk about Bob Jervis, Rose McDermott. We can go on and on. There are tons of people that we can talk about. But the emphasis when we think about intelligence really has to do with the idea of cognitive bias, mirror imaging, or groupthink on the level of analysis. The problem in intelligence failures really has to do with the idea of analysis. There's a mismatch between how we think about estimates and how we think about reality. But when I started doing the archival work, it became clear that that is only one part of the actual answer, the bigger argument. The bigger argument really had to do with what Jervis later wrote about in his book, Why Intelligence Fails, that came out in 2010 about Iran, was that in Iraq, there's a similar case here where the intelligence failure was primarily rooted in poor collection methods. But that's something that I could not pick up on in secondary accounts. Once I did the primary research, and this is, I'm talking about memoirs, I'm talking about CIA records, I'm talking about State Department files, I'm talking here about oral histories and interviews with diplomats that are hosted by the Library of Congress, right? I looked up at these documents and realized that everyone was talking about the fact that American officials basically stationed in Baghdad and Kirkuk had a very, very, very weak relationship with any members or any human source of intelligence outside the regime circles. But that's something that was not obvious, right, in existing scholarship, that they lacked access to a circle that is across the political spectrum. So they had no informants in the Lebanese, in the Iraqi Communist Party, no informants in different opposition movements, no informants in underground movements, and even their relationships with military officers were based on a certain grade. So they didn't have a good relationship with junior officers. And junior officers, if you know really about civil military relations, you know for a fact that junior officers are the key group, not the only group, but the key group to understand the possibilities of when a coup might happen or not. So the archives pushed me to know that in reality, it's not that those before me were wrong, but it's just those before me were doing an incomplete argument. They were providing an incomplete theory, if you want, on the basis for why we have that intelligence failure. So the refined conclusion based on archival research, based on mining the data, pushed me to further qualify the argument that says, in reality, if you want to think about failure at that moment in time, I have to take this two-step process. I have to look at the level of collection and the level of analysis. And this is something that was mirrored in what Jervis discusses regarding the collapse of the Shah and the revolutionary moment in Iran in the late 70s, right? That was Savak's focus on maintaining relationships only and primarily with American officials that was such a big blind spot for American officials, because they knew nothing outside of Sapak. They had no interest whatsoever in Islamist movements, leftist movements, or opposition movements. And this is really mirroring what I was able to come up with and be able to find in terms of archival support for the argument on how we can understand a refined conclusion on the sources of misperception and the sources of failure when we think about America and Iraq in the late 1950s. So just a few reflections on these examples before we go to the Q&A. Without archival research, at least from my own work, it would have been impossible to understand the interaction between various US officials. This is not an equal playing field, but archival research demonstrates how many documents don't end up being read or received by policymakers. Because if you look at the Eisenhower special files, for example, that is a copy of the documents that he actually saw and signed, and not others that have actually used his name or someone in his office that actually had read them or not. The discord and harmony cannot be recreated but by looking at the actual source. No one in hindsight is going to tell you, well, I wasn't happy with the president, or I wasn't happy with the foreign secretary, I wasn't happy with the CIA director, but that discord and harmony is visible in the pushback and diplomatic cables, consular dispatches, and reports being written in the field. And the bigger question for my work is, well, to what extent can we think about intelligence or lack thereof having an influence in foreign policy? Does it have any impact? Do we pay billions of dollars every year for a defense budget and the CIA budget? In reality, are they doing anything when it comes to foreign policy? Are they really helping diplomats and policymakers do better decisions? If I say yes, I need to back that up. And to back up that assertion, I really had to connect the dots between to what extent were intelligence estimates being really used and being heeded by policymakers. And another important part of this reflection really has to do with the interpretations of US officials in real time. I don't really care in hindsight if everything becomes clear, right? We're all biased of hindsight clarity and hindsight bias. We knew that the regime in Iran was unstable. We knew that Mubarak was going to be kicked out. These are sentimental phrases that you can see very vividly in op-eds, but I really wanted to look at the record in real time as it was unfolding. So what were the reports that were being written before 1958, before 1963, before the war in 1973, before the invasion of Lebanon by Israelis in 1982, before the beginning of the Civil War in 1975? To what extent were people talking about the actual possibility of a skirmish, right? Will the FLN win? Going back to Peter's examples, like how can you think about the FLN winning? What were we writing during the Algerian War of Independence in reality? Strategies, tactics. And another important part here is that to unpack the decision-making processes and the different units that have weight, right? Is it lobbies? Is it oil cartels? Or are we really talking about one person running the show? What does it mean to have two brothers in some of the highest positions in America, the Dulles brothers, for example? What are the implications of having the Secretary of State and the DCI both be from the same family? Does that in any shape or form impact decision-making? And for our purposes and what I do, because as Peter mentioned, I didn't just want to write a book or publish articles that are going to focus only from an Anglo-American perspective, was really trying to bring to the table and bring to the fore the discussion of interactions between Anglo-American officials and Arab political actors. So everything that I did on the Western side of the pond, if you want, had to be to a certain extent recreated in different capitals and cities and towns in the Middle East. I can't write about Jordan or about Syria or about Egypt or about Lebanon in the period I'm looking at during the Cold War without saying, well, to what extent did these actors also have an influence on US decision-making? Because at the end of the day, these are the sources of information that are being consulted by American officials that are in the field, right? These are their sources of information, whether they're underground movements, whether they're open sources, whether they're closed sources, whether they're informants. But at the end of the day, it's important to understand to what extent is there an alternative understanding that we can think of when we look at decision-making processes happening in Washington, but in reality having roots to a large extent in many capitals across the Middle East. And this has led me to really consider and be able to reframe how we think about agency, right? And Peter mentioned the agency of the FLN, the agency of different Palestinian national movements. And what does that mean in terms of thinking about the success or failure of being able to create a state or not? And in my case, to what extent did that impact how American officials perceive the limits of their foreign policy decisions when it relates to oil, when it relates to supporting regimes, when it relates to extending foreign aid. And that will not be a complete explanation if I'm not able to trace who these individuals are, what are they doing, and why are their names mentioned in tons and tons and tons of documents. What does it mean to think about the meetings, for example, between King Hassan of Jordan and different CIA officials, right? That's not something just to phantom over and just say, well, there's nothing behind these meetings. Or relationships between CIA officers in Lebanon and getting funding from different institutions to instigate and support the coup that failed and occurred in Syria in 1956, for example. If I look at it from one perspective, it's just going to look like a coup that failed and America did not have enough information, or the CIA failed to support the right group in order to stage that coup successfully. But if you take a step back and you look at the other side of the argument, the other side of these documents, you dig deeper and you realize that many Syrian officials for 2 months, basically using different radio channels, were mentioning that a coup is going to happen. And we know this is supported by the West. We know this is supported by the Americans, and we're going to foil it. And that's why on August 12th, this was announced on different Syrian broadcast channels. And I'm talking here about August 12, 1956, right? It was announced that, look, in reality, we know this was going to happen and we're going to arrest everyone that was involved.